And right now, I'm very honored to introduce the keynote speaker for the night, Mr. Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is an American political journalist, lawyer, columnist, blogger, and author. In August 2012, he left his job at Salon.com and became a columnist at The Guardian newspaper, to which he has contributed since June of 2011. Glenn worked as a constitutional and civil rights litigator before becoming a journalist. He contributed to other newspapers and political news magazines, including the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Greenwald has written 4 books, 3 of which have been New York Times bestsellers: How Would a Patriot Act?, A Tragic Legacy, and With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful, released in October 2011. Mr. Greenwald was also named one of the 25 most influential political commentators by The Atlantic, and one of America's top 10 opinion writers by Newsweek. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Glenn Greenwald.
Good evening to everyone, and thanks so much. And thank you very much to CAIR for inviting me to come and speak here with you tonight. I speak at a lot of events, and this is an extraordinarily vibrant and energized event. And beyond that, there really is no organization with which I'd rather be spending my time or with which I feel more at home than CAIR. And that's especially true of the chapter that really kicked it all off. And the reason I say that that's true is because this is an organization which, over the last decade especially, despite being targeted with all sorts of malicious attacks and coordinated smear campaigns, including from our own government and various other precincts, has continued to devote itself relentlessly and really quite heroically to the fight for what I think is quite clearly, far and away, the greatest civil liberties crisis of our generation, at least, which is the persecution of Muslim Americans and Muslims generally in the post 9/11 era, which is really an assault on the liberties of everyone. And I just want to share with you a recent experience that I had that underscores not only why I consider the work of CAIR to be so critically important, but also highlights several of the issues that I want to spend some time discussing with you tonight. As Attar said at the beginning, I travel quite extensively. And one of the reasons I do that, one of the reasons why I consider it such a valuable opportunity is because when I do that, I'm able to go to places and meet the human beings whose lives are severely harmed, often destroyed, by the kinds of rights violations, the kind of civil liberties assaults that we're talking about tonight. And what it does is it vividly underscores that the things we're discussing, the work which CAIR does, is not an abstraction. They really are things that devastate the lives of countless human beings and their families, and traveling around and speaking directly to the people affected prevents one from conceiving it as an abstraction. It's very emboldening. For me personally, it's what sparks my passion. And a few weeks ago, I was headed to Qatar. I was doing election coverage for Al Jazeera, and out of the blue, very coincidentally, I was contacted by CAIR lawyers with whom I had worked in the past on several issues, and they said to me, we have this case that we're working on that, although it's a common civil liberties abuse, it's a particularly egregious and infuriating case. And it just so happened that the person who they were representing lives in Qatar, in Doha, where I was going. They didn't know that. And I said, well, look, I'm going there. Please arrange for me to speak with that person. I'll meet with him, and then I'll write a story about him. And I got to Doha, and I met the person whose case they were working on. His name is Sadiq Long, and Sadiq is an African-American who is a convert to Islam. He converted in the 1990s when he was serving in the Air Force, where he served for over a decade. And since he got out of the Air Force in the late 1990s, he's lived teaching English and doing other odd jobs in Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and now in Qatar. And at the beginning of this year, Sadiq got a call from his mother, who lives in Oklahoma, where Sadiq was born and where he was raised. And she told him some very sad news, which was that she was suffering from an extremely serious medical affliction for which there's no treatment. And the wish that she expressed to him was that he would come and visit her for what was clearly to be one last time. He hadn't been to the United States in almost a decade. And he doesn't make very much money. He saved his money for months. He purchased a ticket to travel to Oklahoma, his childhood home, and was about to travel, and 24 hours before he was to board the plane, in fact, less than 24 hours before he was to board the plane, he got a call from KLM Airlines informing him that they were not going to permit him to board the flight. And when he asked why that was, they told him that the United States government had decreed him to be on a list of people prohibited to fly into or out of the country. He has never been indicted with a crime, never been charged with a crime. He's lived in countries with governments extremely close to the United States for a decade. Not once has the US government even sought to question him or inform him about any wrongdoing of any kind. Simply out of the blue, they decided in an invisible way to deprive him of this right and prevent him from traveling to his own country to visit his extremely sick mother. And when I met with him, I spent 2 or 3 hours talking to him, and he had this very quiet, righteous anger, which is certainly understandable. The fact that his own country, one that he served for 10 years, some invisible government official simply deprived him of this core right of citizenship, which is to enter your own country, and did so invisibly, with no transparency, no notice of any kind, no indication of what the alleged wrongdoing was, no evidence presented, simply decreed that this right would be deprived. And what he said to me was that although that made him so angry, the part that became so dispiriting to him and so draining and frustrating was not that injustice, which he knows other people have been subjected to and worse, but the fact that he simply had no recourse. He couldn't find out how he could challenge this determination. He called numerous organizations ostensibly devoted to civil liberties, and none would take his case. And it was only finally when several months later he called CAIR, and lawyers at CAIR agreed to represent him, did he finally feel empowered and emboldened. And they put him in touch with me. I was able to write an article that got a lot of attention about it. Lawyers at CAIR have been working to pressure the Department of Homeland Security, and hopefully within a week, fingers crossed, he's now going to be able to get on a plane and go and visit his mother, who's now very, very ill. And what really struck me about that was that ordinarily the kinds of civil liberties abridgments that we talk about, that I work on, that I write about, are ones that take place in obscurity. They are targeting people who have no defenses. We don't normally even hear about them or know their names because they resign themselves to the deprivation. They conclude that there's no recourse that they have. And what was so impressive to me, what really struck me about the fact that CAIR worked on his behalf, was how emboldened and empowered he became. He became extremely interested and engaged. He learned everything about his rights. He's extremely an articulate and passionate activist now, and who knows what impact he will now have on others. And this is something that repeats itself over and over. The civil liberties abridgments that we talk about are much, much worse if there's no organization like CAIR and they lack the resources to be able to provide the kinds of service that they provided in the case of Sadiq. And that's why I'm really delighted to be a part of anything that CAIR does and to support the organization in any way that I can. Now, I speak a lot about civil liberties. Civil liberties is what I think about in terms of my primary focus. I said earlier that I think that the greatest civil liberties crisis of this generation is the persecution of Muslim Americans, and this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. We talk a lot about our civil liberties, or the sign in front of me, the title of the event is Upholding Our Constitution, and there's lots of different ways to talk about that topic. There's different approaches we can take, but no matter what we do on this topic, one of the things I think is most important is to spend a minute thinking about what it is that we even mean when we talk about civil liberties, when we talk about our core basic rights or upholding the Constitution, because these terms get thrown around a lot in lots of different contexts without much attention being paid to what the term denotes. And so I just want to spend a second focused on what that means, why this term is so critical. And the good thing about asking that question, what are civil liberties? What are these core constitutional rights that we talk about being so important, is that it's not a very complex question. It's not actually that difficult to answer. And the reason I say that is because when we talk about civil liberties or our constitutional protections, all we are really describing, all we are really denoting is the limitations and restrictions that we have imposed on the government in terms of what it is that they can do to us. The theory of civil liberties and of the Constitution is that we accept as legitimate the assertion of state power only on the condition that they adhere to the limitations that the citizenry, first at its founding and then through the next 200 years, has required them to adhere to in exchange for recognizing that legitimacy. And the good thing about asking this question, beyond the fact that it's a fairly simple answer, is that we don't have to go searching for this list of restrictions, of constraints that we've imposed on the government. They're all contained in one place, in one document called the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. And the other good thing about this list and about this endeavor to ask what this term means, this concept of liberty, is that the restrictions that are on this list, the constraints that we've imposed on the government, are not ambiguous or murky. They're not situational or circumstantial. They're extremely clear and they're absolute in nature. They apply to every single group and every single individual equally. They apply in every situation without exception. They aren't suspended or diluted in cases of national security or war. They are absolutist in their prohibition. They apply to the government in all cases and with regard to all people. And the way that you know that that's true, you don't have to be a scholar or somebody who's studied this topic for a long time. You can just look at what this list of restrictions say. And you look at the First Amendment and it says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. You look at the Fourth Amendment that guarantees that we will be free of unreasonable searches and seizures, except with a finding of probable cause and the issuance of a search warrant by a court. You look at the Fifth Amendment, which says that no person shall be deprived of life or liberty without due process of law. These are clear and absolutist in their prohibitions. And the reason that I say that we have a great civil liberties crisis is because these are the core liberties that really were supposed to define who we were as a nation, that are being violated not in isolated case-by-case ways, but fundamentally, systematically. So if you look at the way in which Muslims, but increasingly people who aren't Muslim in the United States, are being prosecuted for material support for terrorism, what you see is repeatedly prosecutions based not on any acts that those people undertook, but on the ideology and political principles that they've expressed, a core violation of the First Amendment free speech guarantee. And if you look at the massive, pervasive surveillance state that has been erected, one that targets not people for whom there's probable cause or evidence of criminality, but law-abiding innocent citizens who are targeted and monitored and surveilled for no reason other than their religion or ethnicity. This massive surveillance apparatus at the federal, state, and local level that infiltrates mosques and student groups and community centers and social communities of all kinds, what you see is a profound and fundamental violation of this guarantee that we won't be subjected to searches and seizures unless there's probable cause to believe that we've done anything wrong. And if you look at the US government's imprisonment, ongoing imprisonment of people, often for life, without any charges of any kind. Or even now, more recently, the targeting of individuals for execution, for assassination, even US citizens, without charges, without transparency, without due process. You see the supreme violation of the Fifth Amendment's prohibition on the deprivation of life or liberty without due process. It is a fundamental and systematic violation of these core liberties, not one that is case by case. And what's most amazing to me about all of that is that the precipitating event that triggered these assaults in this manner, the pretext for it all, which is the 9/11 attack, as we move further and further away from that attack, these rights erosions actually worsen. None of the powers claimed by the state in the name of that event have been relinquished. More and more continue to be acquired as we move further and further away from that event. And so what I want to spend my time doing is asking two questions about that fact. One question I want to ask is, why is it that that has happened? Why is it that we've allowed this fundamental erosion of these core liberties, which we are all taught is what defines who we are as a people and as a nation, to take place with very little backlash? And the second question that I want to ask is, what are the implications, the consequences from allowing that to take place for as long as we have? And the reason those two questions are so important in my view is because it's only by understanding what has driven the trend and understanding why it's so urgent to stop it can we then figure out the best ways to arrest these trends and to band together to fight them. So let me look at that first question. Why is it that we've allowed these fundamental civil liberties erosions to take place for now more than a decade with no end in sight? And I think there's a lot of reasons why, but I think there's a few worth primary attention. The first one is that it has all taken place within the context of war. The United States is a country that for more than a decade now has decreed itself to be a nation at war. We're not at war with just one country, but even in the last 3 years under the current president, there has been the application of lethal force in at least 6 different Muslim nations. It is a global war, one that continues endlessly. And what is so profound about war, the reason why it's such a threat to these liberties, is because it's in wartime when the power of political leaders is at its peak, when it becomes most difficult to limit. And this has always been the case. 2,000 years ago, the Roman philosopher Cicero said that when men pick up arms, the law falls mute. In times of war, there are no limitations on the power of political officials, but what distinguishes our current time from past civil liberties abridgments justified in the name of war is that, unlike in those prior wars, when the abridgments ended when the wars ended, the Japanese Americans interned during World War II were released at the end of World War II. The suspension of habeas corpus by Lincoln was restored at the end of the Civil War. The attempt to criminalize dissent during World War I ended when that war did. This is a quote-unquote war that by design can have no end. In fact, there was just a Washington Post article 3 weeks ago that described the way in which the Obama administration is seeking to institutionalize their power to imprison people without charges or kill whomever the president wants, based on the premise that the US government believes that this war will continue for at least another decade. So we're talking about now 2 decades of war with no end in sight. And when you have a war for that long, what you have are not individual abridgments of liberty, but a fundamental transformation of the kind of government that we have. And that's one thing that has made these abridgments continue unabated, is that in a time of war, it is very difficult to argue for limitations on state power. And a supplemental factor in war that makes it such a particularly hard menace to combat is that the #1 priority of a government in war is to dehumanize whoever the target of the violence and aggression is. And the reason for that is because no population will be willing to tolerate having continuous decade-long violence, lethal force used against a group of people whose humanity they're able to acknowledge and internalize. It's only by removing the humanity from that group, dehumanizing them, rendering them invisible, can the state sustain prolonged, protracted support for war. And the target of America's quote-unquote war has been exclusively Muslims. And although political leaders explicitly say we're not at war with Islam and there are only a small segment of Muslims that we are actually fighting, the real message that is sent whenever the US government kills large groups of people and reflexively labels them militants or terrorists or locks people up without charges but assures the citizenry that they should just assume that they're guilty of something, is that Muslims are a real menace, that they, even when there's no evidence presented, probably deserve whatever the government is doing to them. And this is a message that has been indoctrinated into the American citizenry for over a decade now. It's really the way in which war not only degrades the population at whom it's directed, but degrades the national character of the country that wages it as well. And this message, this indoctrination, makes it very challenging to get people to object to these kinds of civil liberties abridgments because they assume it's being directed at a group of people who probably deserve it. So that's one reason why this has happened. The second reason that I want to talk about is one that's related to that, and that is that there is a perception that has been purposely cultivated that there's only one group, one marginalized, powerless group that is at risk from these civil liberties abridgments, and that's American Muslims. And that therefore, the rest of the country need not worry about or object to or care about these abridgments because it's confined only to this group. And this is the tactic of states that abuse their power historically in every case. That is the strategy that they use when they want to seize power. They, in the first instance, target a group that they believe will be most unsympathetic in the expectation, usually true, that the rest of the society will acquiesce to it or even support it. And the problem is that whenever a group is targeted with civil liberties abridgments, those abridgments always, not sometimes, not usually, but always extend beyond their original application. But the problem is that if you acquiesce to it in the first instance, they become institutionalized, they become the norm, and then it's impossible to fight them any longer. And if you look at the history of the last 10 years, this is exactly what you see. If you look at the Patriot Act, which was enacted in the name of terrorism, what you find is that overwhelmingly it is applied in cases having nothing to do with terrorism. If you look at the FBI tactic of creating their own terrorist plots and then financing those plots and then trying to lure Muslims into joining them and then disrupting their own plot at the last minute and heroically announcing to the country that they've saved us all from their own FBI plot, you now see this tactic being used against a wide array of dissidents in the United States, against anarchists, against protesters of NATO policy, against the Occupy movement. And what you really see is the core of what has been called the war on terror now being imported into domestic American life. So you see the paramilitarization of our police forces based on tactics perfected in Baghdad, and the importation of drones, a fleet of which is inevitably coming to surveil the United States in a way that Muslim cities are now surveilled, and ultimately armed drones, which will be in the hands of police officers. It is never the case that abridgments of civil liberties are confined to their original group, but the perception that they will be is a major factor in how governments are able to seize these powers without much opposition. And then there's another factor that I think is important in understanding why this has all happened, and that is the role that partisan allegiance plays in how these policies are perceived. I think there was an expectation that by simply going to the ballot box once every 4 years and electing a better leader, someone who seems like he's more committed to these freedoms than the one who preceded him, that magically all of these rights violations were going to come to an end, that a civil liberties nirvana would descend upon us. And I think it doesn't take much work at this point to convince people that none of that has happened, that the abuses of the prior administration have continued and in many cases even worsened under the current president, who many people thought would end it. And I think the lesson from that, there are a lot of lessons, but the real lesson is that the way in which you fight for liberties, the way in which you battle civil liberties abridgments is not by going to the ballot box and thinking that if you empower a particular politician that he's going to do the work for you. That isn't how liberty is protected or injustice is battled. The way that happens is when citizens band together and fight for and defend their own liberties. And then the last point that I want to make about why I think this is all happening is that it is very easy for what in 1 minute is radical and extremist to become normalized very rapidly. And if you think back to the post 9/11 weeks and months, the weeks and months after the attack, when the Patriot Act was first introduced, it was considered extremely controversial. Now the Patriot Act gets renewed every 4 years without anybody noticing. Nobody talks about the Patriot Act anymore because it's become embedded in our political framework. We've become accustomed to it, and therefore what was once deemed so radical has now been normalized. And I just want to share with you an experience that I had that really underscored for me and really shaped my thinking on this and has stuck with me in a really kind of emotional and visceral way. I was speaking last year at a university in Indiana, Purdue University, and 3 high school students from Kentucky drove several hours to hear me speak. And after I was done speaking, I spoke about civil liberties, I spoke about some of the topics I'm speaking about tonight. They came up to me and they talked to me, and one of the young ladies who was a sophomore in high school said to me, you know, you keep speaking about these radical changes that took place after 9/11 and all of these liberties that we've lost and how we have to restore what we had. She said, but for people my age, I'm 15 years old, so I was 4 years old at the time of the 9/11 attack. There is no such thing as a pre-9/11 and post-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is all that we know, the people who are my age. That's the totality of our political consciousness. And every year that goes by that we allow these liberty abridgments to linger, the harder it becomes to uproot. And the reason is that we're training our citizenry to accept these views of our fellow citizens who are Muslim and the views of what the proper role of government is as normalized, as permanent, and it's much more difficult to combat them each year that goes by. So those are the reasons why I think these abridgments have happened. I just want to spend a little time talking about what I think is the primary implication. There are lots of implications from allowing the government to abridge these core liberties, to removing free speech rights, to putting people in prison or killing them without due process, to engaging in massive surveillance. And there are lots of ones that are obvious, but there's one that I think is not obvious, that's kind of elusive, but probably the most insidious and the most consequential. And that is that when you allow the government to transgress the very limits that define what freedom is, you radically transform the relationship between the citizenry and the government. And by that I mean that in a free society, by definition, those who wield political power, people in government, fear the citizenry. They fear the consequences of what will happen if they abuse their power. In a tyranny, by definition, and this is true in every tyranny in the world today and everyone that has existed for centuries, the exact opposite framework prevails. The citizenry fears the government. And that is what happens when you allow government to transgress these limits, to violate these liberties, not to uphold our Constitution, is a climate of fear emerges that is more effective in denying freedom than anything that the government could do overtly. And I just want to share with you an anecdote that led me to really understand this, not in an abstract way, but very viscerally. And it occurred in January of 2010. And I have spent a lot of time over the past 2.5 years or so writing about the organization WikiLeaks and defending what they're doing. And January 2010 was the very first time that I ever wrote about WikiLeaks. And that was a time when almost nobody had heard of this group. It was before most of their newsmaking leaks about Iraq and Afghanistan. Very few people had heard about them. And the way that I had come to learn about WikiLeaks in January 2010 was that in 2008, the Pentagon had prepared a top secret report. And this report was one in which the Pentagon decreed WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. They talked about how WikiLeaks is posing a profound national security threat to the United States, and the report plotted ways to destroy WikiLeaks, to render it inoperable and ineffective. And ironically enough, this top secret report of the Pentagon got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its website, and the New York Times found out about it, read about it, and wrote this short article saying that there's this strange, obscure transparency group that the Pentagon, for whatever reason, had decreed to be an enemy of the state. And I read the article, I stumbled upon it, and I remember at the time thinking that any group that the Pentagon has decreed to be an enemy of the state and was plotting to destroy was one that merited a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I researched it, and I saw the great transparency that they had brought to various parts of the world, and I wrote a long article about the promise of WikiLeaks and the reason why this transparency model was so important. And I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and I posted the audio of the interview. And at the end of this article, I encouraged my readers to go and donate money to WikiLeaks because I knew they were suffering from budgetary constraints that were preventing them from processing really important leaks. And I posted the PayPal link where people could donate money by PayPal and the instructions about how they could wire money to WikiLeaks. And in response to that article, I had dozens and dozens and dozens of people, literally, in all kinds of venues, in the comment section to that article, by email, at events like this, come up to me and basically say something along the lines of, look, I understand what you're saying about WikiLeaks. I share the enthusiasm you have. I actually want to support them and donate money. But I'm afraid that if I donate money to WikiLeaks, I will end up on a government list somewhere, or even be subjected to criminal liability for aiding and abetting or providing material support to a terrorist organization. And the reason that struck me and affected me so profoundly was because these were American citizens who had decided to relinquish their own core constitutional rights, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is, not because those rights were taken away, but because they were intimidated by a climate in which they know the government can act against them in any way without limitations. That is the climate of fear that gets created. You can offer all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment and call it the Constitution, but if you put the citizenry in a state of fear and make them afraid to exercise those rights become completely worthless. And I see this same dynamic whenever I speak to American Muslims or go into American Muslim communities where people suspect that if some new person shows up at their mosque, they have to be extremely cautious with what they can say out of fear that the person is there to surveil them or trick them or induce them into joining a plot, or they're afraid that if they send emails or speak on the telephone that the government is listening, or that if they express critical views of the foreign policy of the United States that can be used to target them for entrapment or material support for terrorism cases. This pervasive fear that relinquishes constitutional and core liberties more effectively than if they are denied overtly, because people with this fear convince themselves that they're actually free. They tell themselves, if I just hide and stay in the corner, which is what I'd prefer to do, I have nothing to worry about. And when you hide and stay in the corner, it's very easy to convince yourself that you're actually not being repressed. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg said, "He who does not move does not notice his chains. He who does not move does not notice his chains." It's the way in which this climate of fear is so insidious because it convinces people that they're free when they're anything but. Now, the last point I want to make with the little time I have left is to talk about this climate of fear and the reason why, as tempting as it is to succumb to it, it's actually something that should be and can be confronted. And it's interesting because you can go and have a night like this and talk about some of the injustices that are taking place and the rights abridgments and persecutions that are occurring. And there's a danger that you can sort of spread this like gloominess, like dark kind of gloominess and defeatism, where people say, you know, I've just listened to all these things. I think I'm even going to go hide a little bit more carefully now. And the reason why I think that's not the right reaction, why that's such an ill-advised way of thinking, is because what history proves more than anything, as we've heard from pretty much every person who has talked to you tonight, is exactly the opposite lesson. I think the Arab Spring, in which the most deprived populations on the planet, populations that have been kept purposely deprived and yet stood up to and subverted the most entrenched tyranny, should be the permanent antidote to this defeatism. But I think that even American history offers all kinds of examples to prove how compelling that is. And what I want to leave you with is this episode, which is when the founders of the country went into the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and sat in secret and wrote this document. And when they came out, Benjamin Franklin exited the hall, and there was a woman who passed by on the street and said, "What is it that you created in there?" And he said, famously, "We created a republic if you can keep it." And what he meant by that is that this document in which these rights are enshrined is nothing more than a piece of paper, that it's your obligation and all of our obligations to defend them and demand them and to claim them. These are rights which belong to all of you, all of us, equally. And the history of the United States is one in which these injustices have been subverted only by groups resisting that temptation to give into the climate of fear and band together and create coalitions and alliances and empower themselves in order to demand these rights. And it's a slow process, and it's painful, and it's difficult, but inevitably it succeeds if the passion and commitment is there. I think ultimately what the real lesson of current history is, of recent and past history is that any human structure, any structure created by human beings, no matter how formidable, no matter how intimidating, no matter how invulnerable it seems, can always be torn down and replaced by other human beings when the right passion and commitment and strategy is found. And the good thing, the good news, is that there is an organization that has taken its bullets and stood up to this climate of fear and intimidation, that is working very vigorously and often successfully and effectively to defend these rights. And there's probably all kinds of ways that you can support them, whether it's with your time or your talent or your money or your abilities. But whatever it is that you decide to do, I think the animating belief has to be that there should be no doubt and no question that you need to give into that fear, that instead, by refusing to give into it, that's the way that these injustices inevitably will end. So with that, I thank you very much and thank CAIR very much for inviting me here to speak.